Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I know many of you are listening to this as you prepare to drift off, seeking a moment of stillness at the end of a long day. So, before we begin, I want you to get comfortable. Adjust your pillows. Close your eyes. Let the sound of the rain carry you away from the noise of the world. We tell these stories not to unsettle the spirit, but to remember those we have lost, and to find peace in the resolution of the unknown. Tonight, we travel to South Africa. I wonder what time it is where you are right now. Perhaps it is deep in the night, and the house is quiet around you. Or perhaps you are taking a pain-enforced nap in the middle of the day, looking for a distraction from the discomfort. Whatever time it is, and wherever you are in the waking world, you are safe here. The doors are locked. The world outside can wait. Trust is not a physical object. It cannot be held or weighed or measured. It is instead a kind of invisible architecture. It is the roof that keeps the rain out and the walls that hold the wind at bay. But when that architecture fails, when the foundation cracks under the weight of resentment, the collapse is often silent. It does not always end with a shout or a siren. Sometimes it ends with the quiet sound of water filling a tub and a decision made in the shadows of a summer afternoon. Tonight, we do not look for fear. We look for the quiet conclusion to a tragedy that shook a family, and the justice that finally arrived in a courtroom in 2025. This was not a crime committed by a stranger lurking in the dark, nor was it a random act of violence that defies explanation. It was a tragedy born from within the home, a place that should have been a sanctuary. To understand what happened, we must first understand the place. We must travel to the province of Gauteng, the economic heart of South Africa. It is January. In the southern hemisphere, this is the height of summer. The heat in Johannesburg is not merely a temperature, it is a physical weight. It presses down on the tin roofs of the suburbs, shimmering off the tarmac of the highways. The air is thick, heavy with the promise of a storm. In the high veld, the afternoons are often marked by this building tension. The clouds gather in the west, turning from white to a bruised purple, stacking on top of one another like towers of slate. The birds go quiet. The insects stop their humming. The entire city seems to hold its breath, waiting for the relief of the rain. It is a specific kind of atmosphere. The dust from the mine dumps hangs suspended in the golden light, and the smell of the dry earth waiting for water, that scent known as petrichor, begins to rise from the ground. It is a time of day when the line between comfort and suffocation feels very thin. And it was in this atmosphere, amidst the rolling thunder and the heavy heat, that a story of betrayal and loss began to unfold. But before we walk through the doors of that home, we must look to where the story ended. We must look to the High Court of South Africa's Gauteng Division. Imagine a room defined by wood and silence. The High Court is a place of high ceilings and echoes, where the air conditioning hums a low, steady note that masks the breathing of the gallery. It is a place where the truth is often spoken in hushed tones, echoing off the polished benches and the stern faces of those who serve the law. In August of 2025, the courtroom was filled with this heavy silence. Outside, the world continued to turn. Cars moved along the highways, and the jacaranda trees waited for their season to bloom. But inside, time seemed to stand still. A woman named Amber-Lee Hughes stood before Judge Richard Makhabela. She was 26 years old. She was a former preschool teacher, a title that usually carries with it an inherent promise of care and protection. But as she stood there, the weight of the past 2 years hung around her like a heavy coat. The charges were severe: premeditated murder, rape. The victim was not a stranger, but a child who had looked to her for guidance, a 4-year-old girl named Nada Jane Chalita. The court proceedings would reveal the fracture in the foundation of their lives. They would expose the infidelity, the emotional collapse, and the twisted logic that led a caregiver to believe that death was a form of mercy. But as we sit here tonight, safe in the quiet of our own rooms, we know that justice has already spoken. The gavel has fallen. The story has an end. And in that ending, there is a strange, somber peace. So let us lower the volume of our thoughts. Let us step out of the heat of the day and into the cool, dim light of the narrative. We are going to walk through this story step by step, not to relive the pain, but to witness the process of truth finding its way to the surface. The rain is beginning to fall now, tapping gently against the window pane, a steady, rhythmic drumming that washes away the dust. Let it wash away your tension as well. We are going back to the beginning, to the time before the storm broke, when a teacher and a child were just two people living in a house that was slowly losing its air. Hello everyone and welcome back. I know many of you are listening to this as you prepare to drift off, seeking a moment of stillness at the end of a long day. So before we begin, I want you to get comfortable. Adjust your pillows, close your eyes. Let the sound of the rain carry you away from the noise of the world. We tell these stories not to unsettle the spirit, but to remember those we have lost, and to find peace in the resolution of the unknown. Tonight, we travel to South Africa. Tonight, we do not look for fear. We look for the quiet conclusion to a tragedy that shook a family, and the justice that finally arrived in a courtroom in 2025. But to understand the end, we must first understand the place. I wonder what time it is where you are right now. Perhaps the night is deep and the house is still, or perhaps the sun is just beginning to set. Whatever the hour, imagine for a moment that it is January in Johannesburg. Here, on the Highveld, the world moves to the rhythm of the summer storms. The heat hangs heavy in the air, a physical weight that presses down on the tin roofs and the dusty streets. It is a time of year when the sky turns a bruised purple in the late afternoon, signaling the arrival of the rain. The locals know this weather well. They know the static electricity that builds in the atmosphere, making the hair on your arms stand up just before the clouds break. It is a land of extremes, where the sun bleaches the color from the grass, only for the thunder to roll across the plateau like a drum, bringing the water that turns the earth dark and fragrant. There's a specific scent to a Johannesburg storm, a smell of wet earth and ozone that rises from the asphalt, signaling that the heat has finally broken. This is the backdrop of our story. Not a dark alley or a cold winter night, but the humidity of a southern hemisphere summer, where the cicadas hum in the trees and the air is thick with anticipation. It is in this climate that life unfolds, behind the high walls of suburban homes and within the cool, shadowed halls of justice. Let us move now from the open air into the center of the city. We find ourselves standing before the High Court of South Africa's Gauteng Division. It is a place of stone and history, a building designed to withstand the passage of time. Inside, the air is cool and still, a sharp contrast to the sweltering heat of the streets outside. The sounds of the city, the taxis, the traffic, the distant thunder, fade away as the heavy wooden doors close behind us. The courtroom is a space of ritual. The floors are polished wood, worn smooth by decades of footsteps. The benches are hard and straight. Dust motes dance in the shafts of light that pierce the high windows, suspended in the silence. It is a place where the truth is often spoken in hushed tones, echoing off the high ceilings of the halls of justice. Here, the chaotic events of the outside world are brought into order. They are catalogued, examined, and weighed. In August of 2025, this room was filled with a heavy silence. A woman stood before the bench, her voice trembling as she spoke words of regret. But the wood and the stone of the courtroom do not feel emotion. They only hold the record of what has been said. The proceedings were calm, methodical, and necessary. They were the final act in a play that had begun 2 years earlier, in a house that should have been a sanctuary. As we settle into this story, let the image of that courtroom anchor you. It is a symbol of resolution. No matter how confusing or tragic the events we are about to discuss may seem, remember that we are looking back at them from a place of safety. The gavel has already fallen. The files have been closed. The rain has washed away the evidence, leaving only the memory of a little girl named Nada Jane. Just as the storm outside cleanses the air, the process of law seeks to cleanse the community of its unanswered questions. So as you listen to the sound of the rain in your own mind, let go of the tension in your shoulders. You are safe here. The doors are locked. The world is turning slowly, and we are simply observers watching the dust settle in the quiet aftermath of the storm. The morning of January 23rd, 2023, did not announce itself with thunder. It arrived with the silent, suffocating heat typical of a Gauteng summer, where the air feels heavy enough to hold in your hands. Inside the home, the atmosphere was equally dense, weighted down by the invisible pressure of the arguments that had come before. It was a Monday, the kind of day that usually signals the beginning of a routine, the start of a week filled with school runs and lesson plans. But on this day, the routine had been broken, and the house had become a solitary island. Amber-Lee Hughes was alone with Nada Jane. There were no other voices to break the stillness, no phone calls to interrupt the spiraling thoughts that had taken root in the 26-year-old's mind. At the time, the neighbors were likely going about their business, tending to gardens or commuting to work, unaware that the walls of the house next door were containing a tragedy in motion. The windows were closed against the heat. The curtains were drawn, filtering the bright African sun into a dull, amber glow that settled over the furniture like dust. In the quiet of the afternoon, a decision was made. It was not a decision born of sudden rage, but one that appeared to float to the surface of a troubled mind like driftwood. According to court documents that would later be filed in the High Court, Hughes began to prepare a bath. The sound of the water running from the tap would have been the only noise in the house, a steady, rhythmic drumming that masked the silence of the rooms beyond. Steam rose from the surface, clouding the mirrors and softening the hard edges of the bathroom tiles. Water is usually a symbol of cleansing, of washing away the dirt of the day. But in Hughes's perception, distorted by the pain of the alleged infidelity and her own pathology, the water transformed into something else entirely. It became a vehicle for what she perceived as a twisted form of mercy. She would later testify that she believed the 4-year-old was better off dead than facing the neglect she imagined would follow in the wake of the family's collapse. In her mind, the water was not a weapon, but an escape route she was forcing open. The details of what happened next are recorded in the clinical language of pathology reports and police statements. We do not need to dwell on the struggle, nor do we need to visualize the panic. It is enough to know that the trust placed in a guardian was broken in the most fundamental way. The bathwater, warm and still, became the final setting for a life that had barely begun. There was no intruder. There was no monster hiding in the closet. There was only the person who was supposed to protect her, making a choice that could never be unmade. When the water stopped moving, the silence returned to the house, heavier than before. It settled into the corners of the room, draping over the wet towels and the toys that would never be played with again. The afternoon light continued to shift across the floorboards, marking the passage of time in a world that had irrevocably changed. Even if the world outside remained unaware, the heat of the day began to break, giving way to the cool promise of the evening. But inside, the temperature of the home had dropped to a permanent, chilling 0. It is difficult to comprehend the logic of such an act from the safety of our own beds. We look for reasons that make sense, for a cause and effect that fits neatly into our understanding of human nature. But sometimes, the logic is flawed from the foundation up. Hughes stood in the quiet bathroom, the humidity clinging to her skin, convinced that she had performed an act of rescue. It was a delusion that would stand in stark contrast to the cold, hard reality of the law that was about to descend upon her. The house held its breath. The day began to fade, and soon the inevitable discovery would shatter the quiet, bringing lights, sirens, and the unblinking eye of justice to the doorstep. But for those few hours in the afternoon, there was only the sound of water settling and the tragic stillness of a decision that had reached its final, fatal conclusion. Trust is a fragile thing. It is built slowly. It is constructed brick by brick, often without us even noticing the weight of it until it is gone. Tonight, we turn our gaze to the role of the guardian, specifically the preschool teacher, who stands as the first line of defense between a child and the vast, uncertain world. To teach a child is to promise them a future. To care for them is to be the wall between them and the world. In the bustling province of Gauteng, where the summer storms roll in with a heavy electric presence, there are spaces carved out for the very young. These are sanctuaries of bright primary colors and soft edges. If you close your eyes, you can likely recall the specific atmosphere of a preschool classroom. The air always carries a distinct scent, a mixture of wax crayons, dried paste, and the dust that dances in the shafts of afternoon sunlight. It is a place of small chairs and low tables, designed for a perspective much closer to the ground than our own. Amber-Lee Hughes lived within this world. At 26 years old, she held the title of preschool teacher, a profession that inherently commands a deep, unspoken respect, Parents hand over their most precious treasures to such figures, believing that the person standing at the chalkboard is a safe harbor. Hughes was not just a teacher, however. She was a stepmother. She had taken on the dual role of educator and parent, a blurring of lines that required a steady hand and a clear heart. Her charge was Nada Jane Chalita. At 4 years old, Nada Jane was at that specific, fleeting age where the world is still magical. It is a time when the boundary between reality and imagination is soft, like the edge of a cloud. A 4-year-old trusts implicitly. They do not look for ulterior motives. They do not understand the complex, dark currents of adult relationships. They simply exist, assuming that the hands that feed them are the same hands that will catch them if they fall. For a time, the routine appeared to hold. There were the mornings of getting ready, the drive to the school, the quiet rhythm of nap times where the only sound is the collective breathing of sleeping children. In this environment, safety is the default setting. The dangers are small: a scraped knee, a lost toy, a spilled cup of juice. These are problems with easy solutions, usually fixed with a bandage or a kind word. The structure of the school day provides a comfort that is rhythmic and predictable. But human beings are not clockwork mechanisms. We carry our private weathers with us, storms that brew internally even while the sun is shining outside. Amber-Lee Hughes was navigating the complex waters of a blended family, a role that can be fraught with invisible tensions. The relationship between a step-parent and a stepchild is delicate, woven from threads of obligation and expectation. It requires a patience that must be renewed every single morning. For Nada Jane, Hughes was the authority figure in both her public and private life. She was the one who set the rules of the classroom and the rules of the house. It was a dynamic of absolute power and absolute vulnerability. The child looked up, and the adult looked down. And in the quiet spaces between the school run and the bedtime story, the foundation of that trust began to groan under a weight it was never meant to bear. But within the walls of a home, the air can sometimes grow heavy with unspoken things. The year turned to 2023, bringing with it the heavy, static heat of a Johannesburg January. In the High Veld, the afternoons are often marked by the gathering of dark clouds, great bruises in the sky that promise rain but often only deliver thunder. The air pressure drops, and the world seems to hold its breath, waiting for a relief that does not always come. Inside the home where Amber-Lee Hughes lived, the atmosphere had begun to mirror this meteorological tension. The air had grown thick, not with humidity, but with the heavy residue of unresolved conflict. It was not a sudden explosion that cracked the foundation of the household, but rather a slow, grinding shift, like tectonic plates moving deep beneath the earth. According to the National Prosecuting Authority, the catalyst for the tragedy that would follow was an emotional dispute centered on the oldest of human grievances: betrayal. There were accusations of infidelity, whispers of a bond broken outside the sanctity of the relationship. Hughes, who had taken on the role of mother figure to a child who was not her own, began to feel the ground beneath her feet turn into sand. Betrayal is a poison that does not always taste bitter immediately. Sometimes it sits quietly, waiting to turn into something darker. For Hughes, The accusation of infidelity against the biological father was not merely a romantic grievance. It was interpreted through the distorted lens of her own internal struggles as a total abandonment. The trust that holds a family unit together, the invisible contract that says we are safe with one another, had evaporated, leaving behind a dry, brittle silence. We can imagine the texture of that silence. It is the kind that fills a room after a door has been closed too firmly. It is the sound of footsteps on a tiled floor, echoing a little too loudly because no one is speaking. In the days leading up to January 23rd, the house likely felt less like a sanctuary and more like a waiting room. The ordinary sounds of domestic life, the kettle boiling, the television humming, the rustle of bedsheets, continued as they always do, but they were stripped of their warmth. The emotional weather of the home had shifted. A cold front had moved in, settling into the corners of the living room and the shadows of the hallway. Hughes would later describe a feeling of desperation, a belief that the walls were closing in. In her mind, the breakdown of her relationship with the father was not just an end to a partnership, but a sentence of neglect for the child, Nida Jane. It was a twisted logic, born of pain and pathology, that began to take root in the quiet hours of the morning. She began to view the child not as a separate entity with a future of her own, but as a victim in waiting, a piece of collateral damage in a war between adults. There was no shouting match recorded in the final hours. There was no chaotic brawl that spilled out into the street for the neighbors to witness. Instead, there was only the simmering quiet of a mind that had lost its way. The dispute had left Hughes feeling isolated, drifting in a sea of resentment and fear. She looked at the 4-year-old girl and saw a reflection of her own perceived hopelessness. The protective instinct, so natural to her profession as a teacher, had warped into something unrecognizable. She convinced herself that the world outside was too harsh, that the father's alleged betrayal had tainted the future, and that she alone held the solution. As the afternoon storms rolled across Gauteng, darkening the windows and drumming a steady rhythm against the roof, the decision was made. It did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived with the stillness of a final thought. The house remained quiet. The furniture stood in its place. The toys were likely scattered on the rug, colorful plastic shapes that spoke of play and innocence. But the safety frame had been shattered. The guardian had become the architect of the end, and the fracture in the foundation was now complete. The rain continued to fall, washing the dust from the streets, unaware that inside, a different kind of storm had finished brewing. The calendar on the wall read January 23rd, 2023. It was a Monday, a day that typically signals the start of a new week, the resumption of school runs and work schedules. But inside the residence, the rhythm of the week had been suspended. The house was not filled with the usual noise of a busy morning. Instead, it held a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that often precedes a summer storm on the Highveld. Amber-Lee Hughes was alone with Nida Jane. There were no other witnesses to the hours that passed between the morning light and the afternoon shadows. The walls of the home, usually a boundary of safety, had become the perimeter of a tragedy that was quietly unfolding. According to the later findings of the court, the decision had already been made. It was not a sudden explosion of rage, but rather a cold, calculated conclusion reached in the quiet corners of a mind under immense pressure. Hughes would later testify that she believed she was acting out of a twisted form of protection. In the distorted logic of the moment, she had convinced herself that the 4-year-old was better off not existing than continuing to live in the environment she perceived as neglectful. The dispute with the biological father regarding infidelity had severed her tether to reality, leaving her adrift in a sea of resentment and despair. The bathroom is a place of routine. It is where we wash away the day, where we find moments of solitude. On this day, the taps were turned on. The sound of water hitting porcelain is a familiar domestic sound. It usually signals care, a warm bath for a child, the scent of soap, the comfort of a towel. But here, the rising water was not for cleansing. The steam began to rise, fogging the mirrors, obscuring the reflection of the woman standing by the tub. The humidity in the small room would have matched the oppressive heat outside, creating a sealed environment where the air felt thick and hard to breathe. There was no intruder. There was no forced entry. The danger was already inside, wearing the face of a caregiver. Hughes admitted to the act. She admitted to placing the child into the water. In her mind, distorted by pain and pathology, the water was not a weapon, but an escape route she was forcing open. She viewed the cessation of life not as a crime, but as a mercy, a permanent solution to the temporary chaos of her adult relationships. The court would later reject this reasoning, seeing only the premeditation of a murder. But in that bathroom, on that Monday, it was the only logic that prevailed. The details of the drowning itself are clinical facts found in the autopsy report. The lungs filled with fluid. The heart, which had beaten for only 4 years, slowed and then stopped. The splashing, if there was any, was eventually replaced by the return of absolute stillness. The water settled. The steam continued to cling to the tiles. The house remained quiet, masking the irreversible event that had just taken place. A life had been extinguished, not with a weapon of war, but with the very element essential for life. And as the water cooled in the tub, the reality of what had been done began to settle into the grout and the floorboards, waiting for the outside world to open the door and discover the silence. The silence of the house was eventually broken, not by a scream, but by the low, static hum of radios and the soft tread of official boots on the hallway floor. When the authorities arrived, the scene did not resemble the chaotic urgency of a television drama. It was procedural. It was quiet. The blue lights of the police vehicles washed over the wet suburban walls in a rhythmic, hypnotic pulse, signaling to the neighborhood that the order of things had been disrupted. Officers moved through the rooms with a practiced detachment, their presence marking the transition of the home from a private sanctuary into a sterile crime scene. The air, once heavy with the humidity of the storm, now smelled of rain and the metallic tang of flashlights cutting through the gloom. Every object in the bathroom, the towels, the tiles, the water itself, ceased to be a household item and became an exhibit, tagged and numbered in the pursuit of a retrospective truth. The investigation that followed was methodical. According to the National Prosecuting Authority, the state began to assemble a case that went beyond the immediate cause of death. The charge sheet, when it was finally drafted, carried the weight of two distinct accusations. The first was premeditated murder, a charge that spoke to the intent behind the water. The second charge, however, introduced a darker, more complex layer to the tragedy: rape. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit rooms of the pathology department, the story of Nada Jane's final hours was told not through testimony, but through the silent, irrefutable language of the body. A pathologist, testifying later in the High Court, presented findings that were clinical and precise. The report detailed a fresh wound discovered during the examination. It was a specific injury, described by the medical expert as having been caused by the insertion of a small object. The timeline provided by the science was exacting. The pathologist stated that this injury had occurred minutes to hours before death. It was a fact that sat heavily in the courtroom, a piece of data that required no emotional inflection to be devastating. Science does not have emotions. It does not have a voice. It simply points to where the truth has been hidden, illuminating the shadows with a cold, unwavering light. Amber-Lee Hughes, when confronted with this evidence, offered a denial that stood in stark contrast to her admission of the drowning. She claimed ignorance regarding the assault. She told the court she did not know how the child had sustained such injuries, maintaining that her actions were limited to the events in the bathtub. It was a defense built on a separation of acts, an attempt to compartmentalize the tragedy. However, the logic of the law is often a process of elimination. The court looked at the timeline and the isolation of the household. On that January day, the doors were locked and the world was shut out. Judge Richard Makabela, presiding over the case in the Gauteng High Court, weighed the denial against the reality of the environment. Hughes was the only adult present. She was the sole custodian of the space and the child within it. The judge rejected her denial. The finding was based on the simple, terrifying arithmetic of the situation. There was no one else. The twisted mercy she claimed to have offered by ending the child's life was contradicted by the evidence of the assault, which suggested a violation that preceded the final act. The paperwork was filed, the pens scratched across the notepads, and the state's case was sealed. The investigation had done its work, turning the silence of a suburban home into a volume of evidence that would wait patiently for the final judgment. By August 2025, the silence of the suburban home had been replaced by the sterile, echoing quiet of the High Court. The seasons had turned several times since that rainy January day, but inside the wood-paneled walls of the Gauteng Division, time seemed to hang suspended, waiting for a voice to explain the inexplicable. Amber-Lee Hughes, now 26, took the stand not as the trusted educator she once was, but as a woman attempting to translate the chaotic language of her own mind for a room full of strangers. Her defense did not rely on denying the act itself. The water and the silence had already spoken to that. Instead, the testimony turned inward, toward a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. To the clinical ear, it is a list of symptoms: instability, impulsivity, intense anger. But to those who live inside it, and as Hughes described it to the hushed courtroom, it is something far more visceral. It is often described by psychologists as living life without emotional skin, where the slightest touch causes a burn, and the fear of abandonment is not just a worry, but a physical terror that eclipses all reason. She spoke of a mind that felt like a house on fire, where every exit seemed to be blocked. In her testimony, she detailed the days leading up to the tragedy, painting a picture not of calculated malice, but of a desperate, distorted logic. She told the court that in her pain, exacerbated by the infidelity dispute, she had convinced herself that 4-year-old Nada Jane was trapped in a world of neglect. In this warped reality, the water was not a weapon, but a door she was opening. She testified that she believed the child was better off dead than remaining in the environment she perceived as hopeless. It was a window into a broken psyche, further illustrated by her admission of multiple failed suicide attempts in the aftermath of the drowning. She spoke of regret, telling the court, "I regret what happened that day. I think about it nearly every day. It was a narrative of shared destruction, a claim that she had intended to leave the world alongside the child, but had failed to follow through. However, the law is a structure built on lines and boundaries, not feelings. The prosecution, representing the order of the state, listened to these descriptions of emotional fire with a cool detachment. They questioned the relevance of her internal chaos to the sentencing. While Hughes described a mercy killing born of despair, the state saw a premeditated decision to end a life that had barely begun. The prosecutor challenged the idea that her perception of the child's living conditions could ever mitigate the finality of the act. Judge Richard Makabela, presiding over the heavy atmosphere of the court, noted the disconnect. He questioned how testimony about the child's home life could weigh against the admission of drowning. The defense offered a why that was rooted in pathology, but the court was concerned with the what. The tragedy of mental illness was acknowledged, yet it sat uneasily beside the reality of the empty chair where a 4-year-old should have been. The explanation was heard, drifting through the air conditioning of the courtroom, but for many, it did not bridge the gap between a troubled mind and the senseless act that ended a life.